I want to begin with a reading of Scripture, and this, of course, is not the whole passage. The passage goes on for another few verses, but I simply want to introduce this passage. This is Paul dealing with government and some instruction on how to deal with government. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except by God's appointment, and the authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Now, and it goes on to say that the purpose of the governing authorities is to punish evildoers, to reward good, because they are servants of God, or ministers. Government is, and those who serve in government, ministers of God. And so, because they're ministers of God, we are to be subject to them. So, let's simply just look here. If that's the case, then what do we do with a nation of rebels? We'll talk about rebellion today. A nation of rebels who rebelled against the governing authorities of their day. Is that a problem? Was that a mistake? No, because first of all, let's see, this passage simply says that government, the authorities that exist, not any particular ruler or dictator or president or governor or mayor, it doesn't mean that each one of them have been it's the government institution itself. God created three institutions, one of government. The most basic one is family government, right? There's a father, there's a mother, there's roles, children. And Ephesians, of course, talks about how to relate to the government within the family. And, of course, you have the church, and there's a variety of different kinds of governments that happen within the church. Of course, our Messiah is always the head of the church, and sometimes there's a pastor, sometimes there's a bishop, sometimes there are elders, multiple elders, but there's church government, in other words. And then, of course, you have civil government. God invented them all. God created each one of them. And when we're talking about this, the question is, what do you do with a government again, created by God? The authorities that exist, the governments that exist, have been instituted, created by God. The particular heads or the leaders, or the figure, the faces, it's not saying that if you're stuck with a lousy leader, I'm talking about Hitler or Stalin, I'm not talking about anybody, in our nation right now. But if you're stuck with a difficult and challenging leader, it doesn't mean that it's instant, that that's God's choice. No, God allows certain things to happen to certain people. But we have an interesting thing here, because when the 1776, when the Second United Continental Congress gathered and drew up the Declaration of Independence, government, as they knew it, had turned into tyranny. And so they responded, when government is no longer performing the function of a minister of God and is doing the opposite, then we've moved from government that is acceptable to government that is now tyranny. So the question is, what do you do when you have tyranny? And so Thomas Jefferson was tasked, when he was given the job to draft up a Declaration of Independence. The Congress knew that the world would need the reasons for such drastic action to be spelled out to a watching world. Not interested in anarchy, was interested in exchanging one government which had become tyranny for another. And so I know it's probably been a long time since you've heard the Declaration of Independence, well, what are you doing reading the Declaration in church? What better place could I read it? We are all believers. We are charged in our form of government, which is by the people, of the people, for the people. I'm a people. You're a people. We're people. And so we have not only the luxury on an Independence weekend to read the Declaration, we have, I think, a responsibility to remind ourselves of our birth certificate. It grounds us. I recently had photos and baby films, Super 8s from decades ago, digitized, and going through the history of my family really helped me to know where I've come from, to remind me. I knew where I came from, right? But it reminded me and grounded me. And I think in our time of flux and turmoil, Sturm und Drang, one might say, that it's good to be grounded. So I'm going to read the Declaration. It's got a list of 27 grievances. We're not going to go through all 27 grievances. I'll simply point out a few that I think are noteworthy. And there are some highlighted words. They're not highlighted in the original, but I do want to point them out because sometimes, because of familiarity, we may miss the significance. In Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. We are a group of states. We are united, but we are diverse. There are 13 states. And just as one can go and see the culture of someplace like, Louisiana has a very particular culture. Certainly, New York City has its own flavor and culture, and the Pennsylvania Dutch has its own culture, and California, well, that's another story entirely. But no offense to you still living in California. Come to Texas, right? But states, we're diverse. But here's the thing. Diversity for itself is never our strength. The problem that Congress wrestled with while they were drafting and meeting was how can we all can't we all get along? And no, because the Bostonians, the Massachusetts, they had John Adams, right? Very different culture and concerns than the southern states, for example. Very different. Diversity. And diversity by itself is never our strength. No matter what the president may tell you, no matter what you may hear coming on the TV, diversity is no one's strength. It is unity in diversity that is our strength. You can be diverse. Diversity simply means you're going to break up into various different balkanized states. Right? 13 colonies, each could have its own flavor. What brings the diverse together? Being united. That reminds me of how the church functions. We're quite diverse. I mean, tell me that Jewish culture isn't diverse from Gentile culture, just in a broad sense. Forget about what kind of Jew or what kind of Gentile, right? But Jewish and Gentile, that's the fact that Jews and Gentiles in this congregation are getting along and brothers and sisters, family, mishpucha, is testimony to the strength of unity in diversity, right? Jesus didn't pray in John 17 for us to all be uniform. He prayed for his disciples to be unified, right? In love and compassion and in commitment to our God and his Messiah. So, it is important to remember what was accomplished in these diverse states, coming back to this very opening statement, for them to be united. But to remember that the idea was never to create a whole nother nation, but a confederation, a grouping of United States. I mean, think about it. I mean, it was unanimous. It's a unanimous declaration. This is probably the last time that Congress was ever unanimous about anything, right? Forget the filibuster. This is unanimous, okay? That's how unified. E pluribus unum, our national motto, of course, along with In God We Trust. But from unity in diversity, many, from many, one. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people, and again, a diversity of people, but they are unified in purpose, one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. And that is one of the problems that we face today in our society. Multiculturalism, I think it's destructive. I appreciate everybody's culture. Everybody's entitled to have their culture. I like eating Jewish food. I also like Italian food. I like Chinese food. I like Indian food. I like Greek food. I like all kinds of food. I like all kinds of color. I like a Greek dance. It's very much like a Jewish dance, but I have a Greek wife. But it's very, very important to remember that the point was not to have multiculturalism, but to focus on one. So the more that people are putting us apart and separating us by color and by sex and by socioeconomic status, and well, pick your issue, the less we become one people. Getting back to our birth certificate, we began as one people. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God, yes, sorry to you atheists out there and you secularists, but our nation is founded with the presupposition that God exists, that he's active in the course and affairs of men, and that he has opinions on their behavior. It's in our founding documents. I know you don't like, this is why people don't talk about the Declaration of Independence, because it mentions God. A separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. This is not a whimsy. This is important. We're doing this thoughtfully and purposefully. We are impelled to separate. We hold these truths to be self-evident. In other words, they are presuppositions of our actions. We don't have to demonstrate their veracity. We believe they are self-evident. If you've got eyes to see and ears to hear, they are self-evident to everyone, even if you're from California. That all men, in other words, all people, humanity, are created equal. Now, the order and the structure of that clause is very important. They are created equal. There's nothing self-evident about man and woman, society, each individual, ending up equal. It's what social justice is. That's what the social engineers are trying to accomplish. It is turning our foundational principles upside down. We begin with the same, every man, every woman is created by God, because you're not created in a laboratory. You're not created by magic. You're not created by some protoplasm. You're created by God. And he creates you with the same worth. Each individual possesses the same worth. We are all created in the image of God, in other words. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. The presupposition of the Declaration of Independence is Genesis chapter 1 and 2. I don't know if you can fight me on that. I think I think that's self-evident. That all men are created. Not that they wind up equal, with equal results. But we're created. We have the same worth. And they are endowed by their Creator, who's the one who created them, makes sense, with certain unalienable rights. That among these, are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This doesn't exhaust the unalienable rights that God has endowed his creation with. It's simply a representative sample of them. So there are all the rights regarding life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. These are not granted by government. Government doesn't grant them to us. If government grants it to us, government can take it away. The Congress is saying no. The Second Continental Congress, no. God gave you these rights. They are before government. Government protects these rights that were given to you not by government, but by God himself. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. In other words, God gave you these rights. He instituted government. He created government to protect those rights. Instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. In other words, the people are the ones who have a say in their government. It's not imposed upon them. In an ideal world, obviously Paul is living in a world where Nero is the Caesar. He didn't have a say in the government system of the world in which he lived in. We talked about citizenship and Paul exercising his rights and all. He made the best of the situation he had, the government that he had at the time. But that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, what ends? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the God-given unalienable rights. It is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. If government is no longer serving as God's servant, punishing and unleashing wrath upon those who need punishment, praising and doing good for those who are just. If government is no longer doing it, you got a choice. Alter the government or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety, in other words, the security, and their happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. This is not something we do because of whimsy. It has to be a very serious thing to alter or abolish government. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. I would say the past 50 years in America certainly play that out, illustrate that pretty well. Though Jefferson later wrote, the tree of liberty must be watered with the blood of patriots every so often. This is not something that people do on a whim. Even when tyranny begins to lift its head. But while evils are sufferable, they'd rather maintain the status quo, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. It's a lot of effort. But, it's an important but that Jefferson gives us. When a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, tyranny in other words, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Why was the Revolutionary War? Why was it led by pastors, by ministers? How did you get so many people on the same page? People realized it was their responsibility, and pastors preached. They weren't afraid to speak out on political matters. It was their duty to train their people in such matters. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies. But such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having a direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world, in which the Declaration goes on to list 27 grievances, some of which were very specific to the time. Some, I think, have some bearing on our lives today. Number 7, for example. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. In other words, the problem back then was the king was limiting immigration. Some might say that we are on the opposite end of the spectrum today. I don't know that that's an arguable issue as well, not only legal immigration, but illegal immigration. The question is, how many people from different cultures, different locations, different backgrounds, how many people can a nation absorb without ensuring that the new people are brought in, acculturated, brought in on the same page, introduced to these ideas, the ideas of liberty and life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, Declaration of Independence, etc. How many people can be brought in who not only are unfamiliar with these concepts, but truly reject these concepts, couldn't care less about these concepts that define America, without irreparably changing not only the culture, but the character of the nation? If I were going to try to undermine the culture of each state, what I would do is I would bring in an influx of people unfamiliar with our freedoms and our liberties and our culture, and then I would distribute them around the nation to the various states so that there isn't a single state that is devoid of an influx of a group of people the size of, let's say, the city of Boston. That's what I would do. Number 10. He's erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. I call that one an evergreen. How many new offices? This is what we call the deep state, the administrative state, the nameless, faceless bureaucrats who actually make the decisions that run our lives today. Unthinkable to those who wrote the Declaration of Independence. An alphabet soup of offices and bureaucrats and new regulations and new weights around the legs of the people to harass our people and eat out their substance. And how? IRS for one, just throwing one out there. His combined, EPA another. I like clean air, I like clean water. Much as the next guy. His combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. I think this is also evergreen. Anytime that we see the liberal world order, that's the new one this week, used to be called the New World Order. That got old, so we call it the liberal world order today. We see that being pushed by government. When we see the United States binding itself to international agreements and treaties, every time we see men like Klaus Schwab and the people of Davos getting together and talking about the Great Reset, you will have nothing and you will like it. Klaus Schwab. Really? Yeah, I would say that we are beginning to bind ourselves, every treaty, every agreement that supersedes the jurisdiction of our nation. Call me a nationalist if you want. I simply say, call me a patriot. For imposing taxes on us without our consent, number 17. Yeah, and how, another evergreen. For depriving us in many cases of the benefit of trial by jury. I used to think, wow, this is never going to happen here in America. One of the great things about America is that you get a trial by jury, due process. And then I remember how many protesters were arrested and still sit a year and a half later in horrible conditions, without benefit of trial, without benefit of jury, without, in some instances, even benefit of charges brought against them. And I say, perhaps this one too is evergreen, number 18. Number 21, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our government. In school, they taught us that we had three co-equal branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And that we wanted to make laws. The only body that could make law was the legislative. But yet, we live in a time when we have a president who has issued, even in his first day in office, 50 executive orders as if he were a king, making law, and once those executive orders are issued, they tend to stick around. We still have executive orders that are in force from not this administration, not the previous administration, but from the 2 administrations ago, 3 administrations ago. The executive's making law, and of course we've just undone one of the great usurpations of altering fundamentally the forms of our co-equal government, with the Supreme Court making law, legislating literally from the bench, regarding, of course, Roe v. Wade. Read that law. Read that ruling, rather. It reads like a law. It does not read like a judicial ruling. I don't have to go to law school to recognize how fundamentally both Roe and Casey after it were from the ruling that just came down, written by Judge Alito. Do yourself a favor. Government is of the people, by the people, for the people. You're the people. Read. Don't just take the newscaster's opinion for it. Don't just take a headline. Read the opinions. See what's going on. See whether or not you think the forms of our government have been altered radically. 22, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. Again, see the Supreme Court today. Checks and balances. Who checks the Supreme Court? We actually have a branch of government that has no check on it, in my opinion. FYI. 27, last one. Is excited domestic insurrections among us has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. Okay, yes. So what the argument is, he is creating, he's fomenting insurrection and unrest among the people. And when government is actively involved in riling up the people and fomenting unrest and bringing that temperature of society up to a boil, we find ourselves in King George territory. We find ourselves in the Declaration territory. Finally, this is 28. It didn't make it in. But just because you need to know, this is the one that, talk about the unification. There was unification on 27. They could not get unification from 3 states in the South on the 28th grievance. But here it is, just so you know that 1619 is a big, fat fiction. This was Jefferson's language. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the appropriation of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. And you know what the word execrable refers to. What this is saying is that there were abolitionists in the 18th century who tried for decades to, since the very first slave was brought to the colonies, there have been people and groups of people and legislative attempts to abolish slavery, and every time it was brought to the king, he said, tough stuff, we're keeping slavery, you have no say in the matter. So, just so you know, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of a distinguished die, he is now exciting those very people, the slaves, to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people on whom he has obtruded them, creating racial unrest. Even then, part of the original draft of the Declaration did not get into the final copy. Final line, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. So, end of grievances, here's the end. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity. We must, therefore, acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace friends. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. We're not just spelling it out for other nations, for the international community. We are appealing to our Creator Himself, the Supreme Judge of the world, the rectitude of our intentions. We do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. How many times has the Lord been referenced? How many times has God been referenced throughout the declaration? Maybe 4 or 5 times. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. I think the Declaration should be read. I think it should be pondered. It's foundational. I think our nation is largely in its state that it's in right now because we have strayed away. Why is the world in the state that it is? Why does the church look the way it does? Because we have strayed from our foundational document, the Bible, the Word of God. Just so. The United States, governed of the people, by the people, for the people. We have a responsibility. Christians, believers, above all, have a responsibility to God and to each other to be familiar with our document, to pass these truths on to our children. Don't let them absorb the monkey business that they're receiving in the public schools and in the culture at large. Teach them the truth. You wouldn't let false teachers interpret the Bible incorrectly. Don't let those to whom we are going to pass the torch of freedom and the responsibility of that government of the people, by the people, for the people, do not let them be ignorant. Do not leave them without entrusting them with an understanding of who we are and our history.